que o Rob Wallace é chamado de um epidemiologista evolucionário, mas eu diria que ele é um epidemiologista revolucionário, né? Muitos já o conhecem no Brasil. Ele tem PhD na Universidade da Cidade de Nova York, pós-doutorado na Universidade da Califórnia, foi consultor da FAO e do CDC e tem um currículo muito interessante, não só, né, nesses aspectos científicos super importantes, mas também pela conexão que durante ele teve na pandemia com populações, né, americanas, com fazendeiros e população sofrendo, né, os efeitos da pandemia. Então, ele tem esse lado também comunitário, educador, né? Bom, o Wallace, né, a importância dele, eu acho, né, ele tem essa conexão de associar o modelo capitalista global, destruição dos ecossistemas, expansão da fronteira agrícola. Então, ele é um cientista que fala muito com o Brasil, né? As coisas que ele estuda nos dizem muito respeito. Ele tem vários livros, né? Uma produção muito extensiva. E, para quem não ainda conhece a obra dele, ele tem um livro traduzido no Brasil, Pandemia, Agronegócio, Doenças Infecciosas, Capitalismo e Ciência, que foi produzido pela editora Elefante. E há uma entrevista dele no YouTube sobre esse livro que também é bastante interessante, bastante curiosa. Eu acho que a gente está muito bem acompanhado hoje. Ele traz a questão da complexidade, traz, né, para uma situação brasileira onde o agronegócio, né, vai se misturar com todas as doenças que a gente produz, e eu acho que a gente tem muito que aprender, né, com ele. Eu só quero agradecer e pedir para ele vir aqui nos dar essas belas palavras e lições. Obrigada, Rob.
I would say, let there be light, but that would mean something I don't mean to intend. Bom dia. Much of my work until now has largely addressed infectious diseases, and Ambrosco's scientific committee asked me to speak today on another danger, climate change and health. Now, clearly, infectious diseases are one consequence of such climate change, but climate change and pandemics also have some surprisingly common root causes we'll discuss today. With Brazil hosting the 30th United Nations Climate Change Conference, or COP30, next year, while suffering critical social and environmental shifts out of recent surges in climate impact, Brazilian public health must, in short order, get on top of what climate change means. Consider this my modest contribution to that effort. For Brazil is in its worst drought on record. Rivers in the north of Brazil have dried up, leaving river communities there landlocked. In the central west, fires are burning in what were once wetlands. In the southeast, more fires. The deforested Amazon is drying out, with the rainfall off the Atlantic Ocean that floats all the way to the Andes now failing. So let's begin with a few slides that capture the monstrosity of the global climatic moment. We see here in orange and red the daily sea surface temperatures for 2023 and 2024, far exceeding all previous years from 1982 on. We see the impact across the globe, with parts of the Arctic 8 degrees Celsius off the 1991 to 2020 October average, with other places, Brazil among them, 4 to 6 degrees higher, including a record 50 degrees Celsius earlier this year along the Brazil-Bolivia border. At the pole, we see sudden surges in ice-trapped methane boiling off, especially in the Siberian Sea. More methane in the atmosphere is likely to spin the climate cycle only faster. Wildfire is in record surge across the globe. The fires we saw across South America in August 2019 here are on repeat, producing 160,000 fires in Brazil in 2024, burning 7.4 million acres in the first half of the year, a 122% increase from 2023. Now, part of the blame can be found in campaigns in industrial slash and burn for beef and soybean, but part of it is a foundational shift in the qualitative nature of the biome, which we'll speak to again shortly. Indeed, the totality of Earth appears entering a foundational shift that threatens what we recognize as modern civilization. We've breached 7 of what scientists identified as 9 planetary boundaries. The 7 are climate change, invasive species, biosphere integrity, biogeochemical flows, land system change, freshwater decline, and now ocean acidification. Now, how do we get here? Climate change and the other exceeded boundaries have origins in modes of production that are themselves tied into broader political economies. To start, this graph here debunks climate denialist efforts to dismiss climate's ongoing change as just a part of the natural variation. So yes, Earth climate has always changed, but by industry, we've added another 100 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the air in the past 7 years alone, far outstripping the momentum of whatever updraft in the Holocene cycle we were on. We see the impact of the resulting greenhouse effect upon global mean surface temperature, ejecting us out of a 12,000-year-old Holocene temperature range. And we've only begun. We've already hit the 1.5 degree mark governments worldwide accepted as an important social and ecological breaking point. Already producing massive surface melting, with much of the oldest Arctic calved ice lost in only 15 years. The same goes for the Antarctic, where presently the Thwaites Glacier at 192,000 square kilometers is threatening catastrophic collapse, with profound impacts on sea levels to follow. The resulting sea change far from the poles will likely impact everywhere else, including Rio, under these 2 scenarios, mild and extreme impact. 25,000 people may be displaced, but the impact will extend to broader losses of access to key tourist and industry sites. Such changes will likely impact local terrestrial ecosystems, as first simulated by Gerten's team in 2013. We see here the threshold level of global temperature anomaly above pre-industrial levels that leads to significant local changes in terrestrial ecosystems. So the regions colored in dark red are projected to undergo severe transformation under a global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius, while those colored in light red will do so at 2 degrees Celsius. More recent projections show the phytoclimate for plants as expressed as the distance between the present and future habitat of each geographic cell here. That is, how far plants would have to migrate to match their present ecological needs to survive. Purple means they don't have to move at all, while the warmer the color, the farther those plants will have to move to survive. And we see the distances here for 2 RCP, or what are called representative concentration pathways, 2 different pathways we might take in deciding what to do as a species to mitigate climate change. So RCP 2.6 is the lowest in terms of radiative forcing for 4 representative concentration pathways. RCP 8.5 is the highest baseline emissions scenario in which emissions continue to rise unimpeded throughout the 21st century. And we see the impacts of climate change projected for Brazil. Across 2 climate scenarios, left and right, we see the projected increases in summer temperatures on the top and winter on the bottom, and their impacts on agricultural yield. With the warmer the color, the greater the declines in yield. Not only will Brazil's cash crops decline in production, but also the kind of native species some view as appropriate substitutes. Here's Lima's group showing the decline of the suitable habitat for the Brazilian pine under 2 climate scenarios for the years 2061 to 2080. The pine is traditionally combined with the agricultural crops in the Atlantic forest. So such Losses in agroforestry may include parts of the rainforest, may turn parts of the rainforest into savanna or even desert. So we're talking about the Amazon being turned and parts of it into desert. Again, under 2 climate scenarios. Along projected changes in combinations of droughts in red and flooding in blue. Altogether likely displacing human populations out of their traditional lands, even while sea change drives population off some of the coast. Under 2 climate scenarios here, Oliveira and Pereda project migration rates will be 10% higher, with nearly 1 million more people migrating under the coming climate conditions. They also project this next great migration will exacerbate regional inequalities, with the bulk moving from poorer states to richer states, as shown here in the changes in wages and housing prices caused by these population shifts. Such root shock displacement will have profound effect on people's well-being, from their very ability to survive, including access to drinking water, with most sites projected here to be increasingly drying up, to surviving the new wet bulb temperatures, making cooling off by sweating increasingly more difficult under the 2 climate scenarios here, left and right. With the top there are when the scenario says forests are going to remain in place, and the bottom there is when those areas are turned into savanna. And we'll have reduced rainfall, leading to more fires and decreasing air quality, and likely impacting people's mental health, including from social disconnection and the affective disorders of no longer recognizing one's own homeland lost to climate shifts. Under a worst-case scenario, we might ask, what does it mean to be Brazilian when the very cultural archetypes we see ourselves in are no longer ecologically supported? And finally, for health impacts, the spread of infectious diseases. We already see here changes in the distribution of dengue and other vector-borne infections, driven by combinations of climate and land use, with so-called exotics like Zika moving in, and endemic pathogens changing their range, and previously marginalized infections reemerging. Now, I want to insert here a note of hope and accountability. One does not want to have the reputation of being Dr. Doom. There's some, what good news we can find from here is that all these results I just reviewed were produced by Brazilian scientists. So in other words, the public health people in this room have, in these natural scientists, all the technical support they will need to further develop a public health program for the incipient changes Earth is already undergoing. And as of yesterday's morning plenary presentation makes clear, these kinds of collaborations are already taking place. So we should take great trepidation over the dangers that Brazil now faces, but also take great courage in the possibility, under good governance, that actions remediation can take place. So these specifics matter, and preparation at the clinic and lab and ministry levels are critical. But while such collaboration is necessary, it is also insufficient. Why? The problem ultimately exceeds the scale of the interventions that we've just described. Climate change and pandemics represent what philosopher Timothy Morton identifies as hyperobjects. Hyperobjects are problems that are everywhere all at once, across multiple scales, as shown here for climate. The problems are foundational to humanity's existence, whether or not we're directly impacted or immediately affected. There's nowhere else to run. We're here on planet Earth, and the problems are deeply bounded to humanity's global political economy of the past 500 years. I'm going to make it plain here. Much of the global North treated the global South as its refrigerator and its toilet, taking resources and leaving the health damage behind to the tune of millions of lives a year. That still goes on, but now the system is producing damage that extends to the global North itself. Indeed, everywhere. As geographer Jason Moore writes, these hyperobjects have political origins. So we can't solve this with technical expertise or interdisciplinary collaboration alone. By fossil capitalism, civilization engaged in a variety of shifts in the energy regimes that kept regional cities afloat. First wood, then peat moss, then guano, coal, and oil, with the switch to petroleum and natural gas prefiguring both the carbon dioxide and temperature spikes that we talked about. Indeed, we can be more specific at this end of the change in modes of energy production. We can assign blame to certain companies. Here we have the 100 state and privately owned companies that represent the greatest contributors to greenhouse gases in both what they produce and how. So the highest emitting companies since 1988 that are investor-owned include ExxonMobil, Shell, BP, Chevron, Peabody, Total, and BHP Billiton. Key state-owned companies include Saudi Aramco, Gazprom, National Iranian Oil, Coal India, Pemex, and CNPC, or PetroChina. Coal emissions from China are represented by the state, in which key state-owned producers include Shenhua Group, Datong Coal Mine Group, and China National Coal Group. So by attributing operational and product greenhouse emissions in this way, for the first time, we have a rare producer-side view of climate accountability. The point is, however, is that it isn't just a matter of specific companies or modes of energy. The damage here is emblematic of a particular social projection far different from the early energy regimes we began with. Philosopher Istvan Meszaros diagrammed the relationships shared across nature, capitalism, and science. So we start here with a triangle representing what was humanity's mutual metabolism with nature, spotty as it was, up until global capitalism's emergence. So N there is nature, H is humanity, I is industry, our capacity to, in the broad sense of changing nature for our purposes, using nature for our purposes. Now the second plane here of interactions around producing and privatizing surplus value gashes up above, necessarily dependent upon that first triangle, our primary metabolism, but now it's organized around capitalist dynamics first and foremost. That is, nature and people are projected off Earth proper into a distinct space where alienated nature, AN, and people are alienated into labor and profit, and they're interacting on commoditization's terms alone. And the science to use to track all this, oh yeah, there's the alienation for people. Sorry, I missed that. But you have this new way of interacting that's no longer what we had done previously. And it's capitalism that drives this new kind of interaction on for commodity's sake alone. And so the science here that we use to track this is enmeshed in this system. And so modern science is its own production, which is looped into profit or its upkeep, largely emerged helping construct this second plane as a means of organizing colonial labor power and making newly discovered nature legible to capital accumulation. So the difference between basic and applied science, which is so central to our understanding of how modern science works, is caught in this. So the natural sciences here, we think of natural sciences as looking at nature here. But in fact, the applied sciences looks at how the industry can be alienated and applied here. So we have a sense of what we're doing with that, like whatever, better living through chemistry, we understand that that's what that kind of science does. But natural sciences, we think we're looking at this, and that's not what we're doing. We're looking at alienated nature, and we never learn that in our courses at school. We always presume that we're looking at this aspect of the world, when in fact we are looking at how nature, as it is basically encompassed into the commodity production. So, meanwhile, ethics, political economy, and the sciences are, as disciplines, decoupled from each other, each focusing upon a different point in the space, which is why natural scientists have such a difficult time integrating their work with notions of ethics and political economy beyond general appeals to helping humanity. Now, where we've ended up in a kind of freewheeling neoliberal capitalism depends in part on what philosopher Alain Badiou described as the tyranny of liberal parliamentarism. Now, looking around at the spread of authoritarianism now in the West, including in my home country, the United States, we might reasonably reply, as several speakers have over the past couple days, democracies are problematic, but consider the alternative. And I entirely agree with that. But whether autocratic or more democratic, however, countries are defined by a class character. In this case, we see that even as we've accumulated all this science and all this data and all this understanding of climate change, and yet the efforts of countries to negotiate global agreements haven't stopped the climate trajectory that we're on. In fact, the volunteer nature of the Paris Agreement is why climatologist James Hansen called the agreement a fraud. Now, in order to keep such a machine of a system running, we have some weird possibilities that are being presented. So instead of changing the mode of production that produces all this damage, because along the way it also produces a lot of money for a few people, we're gravitating toward doing this really weird intervention. So we have members of capital exiting who are no longer under the confines of state governance, now supporting more technological interventions. So while carbon capture is an untested technology to extract carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, likely costing trillions of dollars to even just toy with it, many climate scientists regard other forms of geoengineering as dreams or even nightmares from science fiction. So one possibility is what's called the aerosol approach. And it aims to disperse so much sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere that when it converts to sulfuric acid, it will cloud a fifth of the horizon and reflect back 2% of the sun's rays, buying the planet at least a little wiggle room, at least heat-wise. But along the way, it will turn the sky red and make acid rain. There are more progressive interventions around the world, and they are, however, these progressive possibilities, say the Green New Deal in the United States or other versions of that in countries elsewhere. But those efforts are basically unlikely to happen in the face of the political system that is, in essence, allowing billionaires to wander unencumbered, threatening to scorch the sky like a James Bond villain, to be blunt about it. But the Green New Deal, and here shown U.S. Senator Ed Markey and U.S. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. The proposal is threaded through with some of the right rhetoric, but will unlikely ever be followed up in the U.S., particularly as with President Trump's re-election, will be re-exiting the Paris Accords. But the U.S. isn't the only leader here. Agrarian sociologist Max Eil details that there are all sorts of different proposals out there. There's an EU Green New Deal, there's a degrowth one, a green social control one, a technocratic one, Cochabamba, a reformist, eco-socialist, Michael Bloomberg's Malthusian, there's a red deal, there's an eco-modernist, there's a planetary New Deal, there's a fortress New Deal. Now, these are, in other words, there are lots of possibilities on the table, and almost all of them are presently blocked by the political classes in power. So global governance is clearly the big issue, but could we even get the job done if given the go-ahead to seriously tackle it? Much attention has been paid to turning agriculture, a source of 30% of greenhouse gases, into a means by which carbon can be sequestered into living soil. So here the Rodale Institute describes sequestration trials from around the world with extrapolations to global cropland. So we have from organic, multi-crop, compost and cover crops to biodynamic peanut and no-till corn and pasture, all possibilities other than just growing out cash crop grain for livestock feed. The problem is that we face that even the wildest projections climatologists have presented aren't keeping up with the nonlinear shifts that Earth is undertaking. including this past year, the planet's failure to act as a carbon sink at all. Proposals by the global north's wealthiest that climatologists are rejecting as weak possibilities at best include Brazil's own proposal to fix the problem with new Tropical Forest Forever Facility Fund, recruiting investors to lend poorer countries cheap loans to preserve forests acre by acre. In other words, this fund proposes we borrow money from the rich instead of seizing that amassed wealth, born of an extractivism that caused the crisis to begin with. So we want to monetize all sorts of trendy proposals, nature-based solutions, net zero pledges, 30 by 30 schema, half-earth interventions, and REDD plus pledges that they're all state capital mechanisms by which multinational corporations and investors pry away the last of the virgin farmland still in peasant or state control in the name of saving Earth. So for instance, the Brazilian grain conglomerate SLC Arigola leased the land outlined in yellow in Bahia State, part of an area illegally grabbed and deforested with support from Luiz Ricardi, a former partner of the U.S. Teachers Pension Fund and Nuveen Natural Capital owner TIAA. TIAA also owns lands overlapping the farm, already together 3 times the size of the city of Los Angeles. And SLC uses the farm to supply Cargill and other companies with soybeans. In other words, the consolidation in physical space of getting all these farms together goes hand in hand with the consolidation in ownership. So we have declining number of meat companies in the US, Brazil, and elsewhere. And I'm showing Hormel, Tyson, JBS here. And they've parlayed what's called vertical integration, taking all the different parts of farming, and also in reversing antitrust law into mass consolidation and some of the greatest monopolistic livestock concentrations in the world. And that is having an effect on how we all, including us scientists, see the world. So for instance, to continue on the agricultural side of the problem, it isn't just the size and expansive geography of the system. It's also about time and even the nature of life itself. By our modern futures market of 19th century origins, livestock and crops began to become financialized alive. Organisms are now committed to what are called fungibilities months before their actual births or germination. And these commitments extend beyond their mere identities as commodities on the trading floor, although all of this is now done by computer. Species are treated as asset classes first, subject to price volatilities that are respected as realer than the ecological dynamics into which the actual animals will be born or the crops planted months hence. So in other words, again, us natural scientists are thinking we're looking at nature as nature, when in fact we have a system dedicated to looking at nature as alienated nature, again, in other words, as these asset classes. Oh, looks like it jumped ahead. Let me go back here. Oops, wrong way. So as a result, breeding, birth, and development of the animals or the crops are logistically bent to servicing these market projections first. So for instance, breeding for feed efficiency with early induction and high egg yield produces inherent damage to the animals. And we see here in the red, injured keel bones from industrially produced chicken carcasses. Researchers from Denmark found around 80% of all egg layers have keel bone fractures of varying severity. Poultry thyroids, it's another example. Thyroid is a gland in the neck. They've been selected for failing to recognize when poult stomachs are full, and as a result, broilers are meeting their much larger target weights, a 400% increase since the late 1950s in only 6 weeks' time. The meat is added on so fast that poultry suffer musculoskeletal morbidity and psychopathologies, including stress pecking, associated with growing so much meat on so many thousands of birds bunched together. Oops. Apparently in the timing part of my slides, my apologies, so I may be in a fight with my own presentation here. But these population densities also help select for increasing pathogen deadliness as well. But to the present point about the kind of thinking putting finances before the very animalness of the creatures involved, efforts to prevent such outbreaks are now organized around circumventing birth itself. Specific pathogen-free offspring aren't born, they're built. Sows, female pigs that are on the cusp of farrowing, giving birth, are euthanized in mass before or after delivery by terminal hysterectomy. Their uteri are carved out and placed in humidicribs or doused in antiseptic before the piglets are removed from their uterus casing. Piglets are then isolated and some medically induced into early weaning. So we're talking living fungibilities here. We're talking about the extreme lengths taken to avoid changing the very business model that selects for many of these deadly pathogens to begin with, including circumventing birth itself. But such extremes aren't the grand fixes they claim to be. Planet Farm, growing more and more food, is neither necessary nor a good idea. What is imposed on the individual animal or herd, as we just described, is recapitulated on the greater ecologies. In an economic system dedicated to 3% compound growth, better and cheaper extraction, increasing efficiency per unit currency invested, selects for greater exploitation until a resource is exhausted. Under the present economic model, the paradox is solved only by exploiting an alternate resource once the original is depleted, wiping out the natural base species by species, mineral by mineral, and region by region. And that includes expanding out and commoditizing what was previously only part of a subsistence diet. Running alongside the decrease in diversity per livestock species, there's now an attendant domain switch to the commoditization of wild foods. And the taxonomy is extraordinary. Ostriches are now being farmed. The Southeast Asian porcupine, crocodiles, fruit bats, the Asian palm civet, whose partially digested berries now supply the world's most expensive coffee bean at $1,000 per kilogram. Some wild species are making it onto forks before they're even scientifically identified, including this new short-nosed dogfish found in a Taiwanese market. This isn't merely a matter of a runaway market. Under neoliberalism, the states of the global north and the sub-imperiums further south, Brazil included, organized such haphazard expropriation by, for instance, expanding genetically modified seeds into African markets under the guise of food security, or expanding how insurance markets can target small farmers, as in the case of the Swiss Reinsurance Corporation underwriting the Nigerian Leadway Assurance Corporation's movement into agricultural risk management, privatizing what otherwise had been public support for smallholder agriculture. Altogether, such efforts comprise global systems of accumulation. The world's circuits of capital are deeply embedded into husbandry and land use in ways that extend out beyond just agricultural production. So here, geographer Luke Bergman's group shows the percent of land whose harvests are consumed abroad as agricultural goods in green, but also indirectly, say in feeding workers or supplying inputs for manufactured goods, there in blue. And we have them mapped here for, from left to right on the top, croplands, pasturelands, and forests. So, croplands, pasturelands, forests. And we also have their combination there at the bottom there. So landscapes are globalized by circuits of capital, with capital accumulation in countries other than the countries sourcing the natural resources in red. They are on the top, and consumption abroad on the bottom across croplands, pasturelands, and forests. And so we can see there, let's see if I can get this thing to work here. There in the red here, southern Brazil here, both for capital accumulation and consumption. That means Brazil is producing food for consumption abroad and for capital accumulation by non-Brazilian companies. So yesterday there was a map there of the Improving Human Development Index we saw for southern Brazil, but that might be driven by wages alone. It's worth looking up in. So in other words, it's not from the control of the resources. You know, you're producing food for elsewhere, which is fine, you want to do an export economy, but the capital that it's accumulated is also going abroad as well. So these relational geographies, and what we're talking about is, relational geography is something on one side of the world affects something on the other side of the world. Well, these relational geographies extend to the financial sector's ownership. So geographer Albina Guibadolina examined nearly 7 million ownership ties of close to 3 million firms around the world that added up to 114 trillion US dollars in owned equity. And we see the financial sector there in green with much larger holdings in the US compared to other countries, including in agriculture. So agriculture, but that might be changing, meaning finance might be going into other countries to rejigger their industrial sectors too. But here, the point here, of course, is that agriculture, both in its natural economy and its feudal origins, represents both the cutting edge and final frontier for financialization. Now, the impacts of these holdings are felt far into the forest from which new human pathogens emerge, and climate change is felt the worst. So we have 8 different models here that M. Graziano Cedilla produced, and it shows on the left there short-term and on the right long-term impacts of a 1% increase in the wealth of the super-rich investors on increases in the flow of direct investments into agriculture and the forest. Foreign direct investment is directly related to the area converted into export flex crops. So in the short term, a 1% increase in wealth is modeled to lead up to a 1% increase in investment inflow. In the long term, it's modeled to increase that investment up to 3%. Those are just the models. The empirical data that he's explored show that in reality, the damage is much worse. A 1% increase in the wealth of the super rich can lead to a long-term expansion of the share of flex crops area of up to 10%, often at the expense of the land needed to feed local populations. So the big picture here, this kind of thinking, which is the bedrock of what many natural scientists come into science accepting unconsciously, right? It's called the spontaneous philosophy of the scientist, meaning you were part of society before you ever became a scientist. So what you expect as the natural order of things or common sense is already built in and affects your capacity to conduct science. It can change the very core of our thinking about disease emergence. So the basic assumptions of causality at the heart of even step forwards, like One Health, right? It's viewed as a step forward. We want to integrate how the health of animals, wild animals, livestock, and humans are integrated. That's a good step forward, but it misses the totality of what's going on and can often lead you to the wrong direction. And I'm going to give you an example here. Let's take bird flu H5N1, which clearly emerged in southern Chinese province of Guangdong in 1996 before spilling over into nearby Hong Kong. When we include what we learned about the economic relationship Hong Kong and Guangdong share, causality shifts direction. By the 1990s, the relationship had returned to pre-revolutionary dynamics, whereby Hong Kong acts as the proverbial front of the store, providing capital and marketing for Guangdong, the back of the store where production takes place. So indeed, at the time of H5N1's emergence there, 4/5 of the foreign direct investment through Hong Kong went to Guangdong, including backing the shifts in agriculture and land use implicated in disease emergence. Contrary to the morality tale that repeatedly characterized as Hong Kong as some innocent victim, Hong Kong appears as responsible as Guangdong for H5N1, and causality moves in the other direction as well. In this way, the source of a new disease may not be merely the country in which it first appears, and may extend as far as the other side of the world. We need to identify who funded the development and deforestation to begin with. And it begs whether we might more accurately characterize such places as New York, London, and Hong Kong, key sources of capital, as disease hotspots in their own right. Now, the failures to grasp these distinctions impacts notions of what land even is, with impacts on the science that we pursue. As a group of natural and social scientists wrote, scientists wrote in a Pandemic Research for the People dispatch, quote, "In talking about land use change, scientists may be racing past key assumptions, often taking fundamental concepts for granted. What, for instance, is land, really? Certainly land is physical space where we and other people live, but the land just under our feet is useless. Many scientists, however, reduce an inconceivable whole in the landscape up into the horizon into more digestible bits for methodological reasons that murder the greater phenomenon they study. Many scientists appear to be able to recognize new infectious diseases and their treatment solely in the mirror of the ritual exploitation of the land in this piecemeal fashion," end quote. In the case of climate change, the mistakes would be to look solely on where the greenhouse gases are sourced. So yes, the US, the EU, Japan, increasingly China and India are the major sources. But this misses the relational geographies we were just discussing. So here, Luke Bergman again, showing the emissions any one country produces is driven by the investments that countries elsewhere are making in local industrial production. So we're back to our Guangdong, Hong Kong, back and forth on a much larger spatial scale. Causality may again change direction. The point here is that as long as scientists and citizens alike remain enchanted by capitalist metaphysics, it's going to take a generational fight to turn humanity back toward the kind of natural economy in which we are reintegrated into the planet upon which we depend. All right, not very good news. Difficult situation. But what might we do to move forward? We should consider moving agriculture back into the ecological matrix. We will do more, that'll do more to protect humanity from climate change and new pathogens than industrial agriculture's continued alienation. So we want to reintroduce the agrobiodiversities on farm and across regional food landscapes that will produce, as far as the disease stuff, the kind of immune fire breaks that keep the most virulent pathogens from ramping up and spreading. We want to allow livestock and poultry to reproduce on site, which would reintroduce natural selection as a way farm operations can track resistance to a circulating pathogen in real time. But such probiotic ecologies and their climate change equivalents can succeed only if they're linked to things like farmer autonomy, community socioeconomic resilience, local circular economies, community land trusts, integrated cooperative supply networks, food justice, reparations, and reversing deeply historical race, class, and gender trauma. And there are examples out there, include very much Brazil. The Belo Horizonte food system in the upper left there is known internationally for its brilliance in being able to reintroduce agroecology into the far regions of the city and to bring fresh produce into local municipal markets and municipal restaurants at cheap prices. And that took decades of work to develop. You know, some things still problematic, some working out, but this is the real deal of an agroecology operating at scale in a city of 2.5 million people. And that's something that Brazil should be very proud of in terms of representing an example for the world to learn more about how do we actually operationalize agroecology beyond a few small farms in a local farmer's market. There are other examples. On the bottom left, I show Soulfire Farm in New York. And then on the right there, the Federation of Union, the farmers groups of Niger. It's like tens of thousands of farmers in Niger working together to feed millions of people. So we can do agriculture different and feed the world by doing so. But these represent expansive systemic change, linking socioecologies that we argue are key to stopping the worst of an infectious disease and climate change. Now there's a catch, however. Healing this rift between ecology and economy driving disease and climate change at the heart of modern agriculture involves imprinting a different political philosophy upon the landscape far beyond just green capitalism. Revolutionary transformations are needed, or these agroecological efforts, even up to the scale of regional food systems, will no more than patch together industrial agriculture's violent contradictions. Much work remains, of course. So you can have specific programs and tests in the next 5 years to the generational project of changing our mode of social reproduction. So what I'm getting at here was, I told you that the work that we do together in our day-to-day lives as scientists is critical but also problematic because it doesn't deal with the big picture. But the day-to-day work we do is an important part. So if global governance is worked out, you still need to have some answers about what to do next. So here's our group. In analyzing COVID-19 in the US Midwest, our team plotted combinations of geographically weighted regressions in these hexagons of 50 kilometers across the Midwest to give us a better sense of the complexes of relationships between independent variables like modes of agricultural production and race on cumulative COVID through the first year of the pandemic. Don't worry, we're not going to go into the details here. The point is, we see here in the orange there's a positive relationship between these variables and local COVID, and blue there's a negative relationship. And the point is that you can see all sorts of different parts of the Midwest require different kinds of interventions. And so this would allow us, this kind of work, the kind of regional planning and full array of modes of intervention from on-farm to state programs and kind of the relational geographies that we've been talking about as a way of exiting the problem of producing these diseases in the first place or responding. Each area needs its place-specific intervention. Okay, so that's all well good. The work that we do is critical, it's important. But the problem, however, is that however efficacious our work is, all our efforts, science and agriculture and community decision-making, will depend on the nature of power extending well beyond any scientific team's capacity. And as history has shown us, which decisions are to be enacted where and by whom depends on the wider world. That's all of us here, our fundamental contribution to this generational project. For we won't be able to technocrat our way through climate change or COVID-24 or 25 or 26. It's more of a system problem than that of any soil practice or individual virus. And in that vein, a science or public health for the people must reapply its tools toward helping social movements dedicated to reversing the expropriation driving climate change's worst damage. We need to help break the ratchet of logic here that locks in presumptions about the nature of social reproduction around the needs of the wealthy and the powerful. If we are to replace each of these expectations across the board, we could unplug vicious cycles and replace them with virtuous ones that can feed and support millions without destroying the planet's ecosystems upon which we depend. The problem, of course, another problem, is that regime shifts that we want to pursue are very difficult to do. And so agroecologist John Vandermeer shows here that even when we support such shifts, some will happen at a steady clip in that first diagram there. Some of them will lurch in place, and some of them will take forever to switch, if at all. That leads to the kind of demoralization of those who put mind, body, and soul in trying to do the right thing. So interventions must be carefully planned and pursued in place in people-specific ways. Unfortunately, this isn't just a matter of a difficulty of applying good ideas. Again, this is a matter of power. Our team worked with an undergraduate student, Elijah Howard, at the Fond du Lac Tribal and Community College in upstate Minnesota, to map out indigenous activist murders in Brazil from 2014 to 2018 as a leading indicator of Cargill's soybean production on the Amazon's forest edge, right? So in that vein, using models in institutional cognition and ecology and military science, our group proposed the means by which smallholders and public health practitioners can defeat agribusiness in asymmetric conflict. We don't pretend that our model is going to change the world in that way. It's the people on the ground that's going to do that. But science can extend out into different ways of doing things. Not only is another world possible, but another science is possible, indeed even necessary. But it depends on public health practitioners and agroecologists alike making a decision about whose side that you're on. So, to sum up 4 points that I would take from this talk, climate impact is both a polycrisis, many crisis, and also nonlinear. That is, its factors, weather, landscape, and health, move together and often in unexpected ways. 2, capitalism turns landscape, animals, and people's health into commodities first. That affects our scientific judgment about what climate, land, and health actually are. 3, geographies are relational. What happens on one side of the world affects the other side. That includes striking a new path on climate change. That is, 4, Brazil and the rest of the global South should consider leading the way on climate change, as many parties of the global North are willing to let this disaster happen. In acting, if only for its own well-being, Brazil and the global South can help save the world. So you can read up more of our team's work in these volumes. Big Farms Make Big Flu, Dead Epidemiologists and the Fault in Our SARS, are collections of my popular essays. The 2 books on the bottom are more technical expositions on the topics we touched on today. They combine disease modeling and economic geography, and their clear-cutting disease control focuses on Zika and other vector-borne pathogens here in Brazil. To learn more about what Science for the People might look like in the United States, you can read dispatches from the Pandemic Research for the People at prepthepeople.net and from People's CDC at peoplescdc.org. And as we learned the past couple days, there are many, many, many Brazilian examples of a Science for the People as well. So, obrigado.
Bem, temos o dia inteiro, né, de atividades, é o nosso último dia, né, uma conferência maravilhosa, que começa o dia, né, de forma bem produtiva e estimulante. O Brasil tem, né, muito a ver com tudo isso que foi dito, e cada um de nós, né, depende, um pouco de cada um de nós mudar esse futuro. Então, obrigado por todos estarem aqui e vamos às atividades do dia. Por favor, os coordenadores de comunicações coordenadas enviar, né, o mais urgente possível a avaliação, né, tem aquele link que vocês têm que entrar e mandar as avaliações.